Yeah, that's a really good question. When I first started in community development work, I remember distinctly my first year of working in the community improvement program thinking, we can get all these communities improved in a year. I mean, come on, what's the problem? And realizing that now I am, into 26 years of working in community development, community improvement work. And there's a couple things. One is that there are some things that you can change pretty quickly that are, so wrong that I think just helping people see that more clearly helps it change. There are other things that do take, more than a year. Could take a lifetime. And I also have to remember that people continue to come into the system, if you will. There are, new people are born every day. People leave us, whether through death or, moving on or whatever. And so as human beings, we have weaknesses and strengths, and, you're just going to see a lot of that throughout your lifetime. And so I think part of it is some measure of patience, getting a good rest. Keeping yourself healthy as you're doing this kind of work, and even as you're part of a movement. If it's not your job, but you're one of those citizens who are working for change, is to always keep your, as my grandmother would say, keep your head about you. Don't sort of devolve into a screaming maniac. Right? Like we've seen some people do. But help yourself understand as much as you can about what you're doing, and help others understand that. I like to think of myself in the kind of work I do as a teacher, as much as a teacher and a colleague when I'm working with community members, and a learner. I'm working with a group of people actually out in South Dakota right now, and I am learning so much from them. And here I am, 56 years old, and I'm still learning, and I think that's probably the most important thing, is to just keep learning. So
I have one other thing that I think you have a unique perspective on, at least from the people we've talked to so far, and that is, people understand, I think, generally, think globally, act locally, but there's a lot of times people in situations where, like, locally is actually regionally.
Yeah.
And in some cases, you have, like, an artificial, like, the Met Council thrusts upon the Twin Cities. But in places, like in rural places, where maybe the solution to the challenges that people face has to be a regional solution, what kind of advice can you offer for people who, who need to kind of expand their notion of local?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work with rural areas, even urban neighborhoods. I think that need to maybe start thinking of themselves as more global, more regional. I think it's important in those situations to help people understand that they can retain and should retain their unique nature as let's just take, for example, a group of small towns, and some of them are dying, and they're all centered around a regional center, perhaps. The opposite of that is, if you've ever been out to western North Dakota, where the oil boom is happening, that's an incredible growth. That's just amazing. But typically it's more about decline because of just the changes in our society and our economy. And so I think it's really important to help people understand that they can retain their autonomy as a small town or a village. They have their culture, they have their ways of being that can still be there, but in terms of their economic viability, I think it's important then to recognize that, yeah, I am driving from my little town to the regional center to work, or I am telecommuting from home and I am part of this large world, but then I am, going to church or buying groceries, locally. I guess it's being intentional about when I'm in my geographic space, my small town or my neighborhood. Support that as much as you can, but then think of yourself also as part of a larger geography, where I always liken it to when I've traveled both across the country and to other countries. If I find an American in Turkey, let's say, I'm immediately drawn to that person, because it's like, oh, where are you from, and what part of the U.S. are you from, and you feel like you really kind of belong to each other because you're both Americans. Same thing when you're in another state and you find that you're from the same state or the same city. So there's always going to be that bond, and I think there should be that bond at a local level. But you also need to be thinking of what other links do you have, and how do they help you sustain yourself and your family and your community, and how do you help sustain that region? And I think that's where you see things happen, like the greater MSP projects and the Met Council, which the whole regional development system started back in the 70s, I think, when there was a recognition that, back as far as the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, towns were already declining. They'd started declining, pretty much with the agricultural revolution back in after the Civil War, and so it's just that recognition that it's a part of our evolution, and things ebb and flow, and just hanging on to your identity as somebody from St. Anthony Park, even if you're living in New York City, or if you're living in New York City and you hear about what's happening back home, to support that too. So it's sort of thinking globally, acting locally, as you say, but also kind of keeping in your heart where you come from.